My daughter invited me on a family trip, then abandoned me without my credit card or passport. I made it home alone, understood exactly why it was done, and took one quiet step that unraveled their house, their money, and their future. But they didn't realize what I'd done until it was far too late. Before I tell you how everything began to unravel, take a second to support this space. Follow along and share where you're listening from, because stories like this travel far only when people pass them on. Every morning for 5 years, I woke up to silence where a voice used to be. My wife, Elira, always rose before dawn. By the time I opened my eyes, the smell of coffee would already be drifting through the house. Now I make it myself, slowly, as if dragging the ritual out might delay the truth. 3 spoonfuls of grounds, 1 cup of water, a pinch of salt, exactly how Elira did it. Still, it never tastes the same. My name is Rowan Hale. I am 78 years old, retired, and I live alone in a single-story house on the edge of Clearwater Ridge, Montana. I spent 45 years as a forensic accountant. Numbers never lied to me. People did. I learned that late. Elira died a year after my retirement. A stroke. Sudden, they said. Peaceful, they claimed. I never believed that part. Our only child, my daughter Maribel, didn't come to the funeral. She had an urgent client situation in San Francisco. She arrived 3 days later, hugged me stiffly, and asked if I planned to sell the house. It's too big for one person, she said, standing where her mother's ashes still echoed. And you're not getting younger. Assisted living might be safer. That was the first time I understood that grief had turned into opportunity in her eyes. Maribel worked in corporate insurance. Her husband, Callum, was a structural engineer. They moved closer 10 years ago when his firm landed a long-term contract nearby. Elira believed it meant family dinners and grandchildren nearby. Instead, it meant polite distance and strategic visits. The twins, Noah and Elise, were 9 then. They were 19 now, studying across the country. I hadn't seen them in 3 years. After Elira passed, my role changed. I wasn't dad. I became helpful. Calls came only with requests attached. Tuition gaps, home upgrades, a new vehicle for Callum. I never refused. I had savings. I always believed generosity might reopen doors that distance had closed. 8 months ago, they bought a house in Maple Crest Estates. I contributed $50,000 for the down payment. Maribel said adding my name would make approval easier. It'll be your house too, she said. You can come anytime. I signed without reading closely. I trusted blood. That was my mistake. I was never invited inside that house. Then came the call. Out of nowhere. An invitation. Dad, Maribel said, suddenly warm, we're going to the coast. 2 weeks. Maine. Thought you might enjoy the fresh air. It was the first invitation in 5 years. Something fell off. The details came too quickly. Passport. Credit card, packing instructions. You won't need much, she said. We'll handle everything. I hesitated, then agreed. Hope can be louder than instinct. 3 weeks later, I locked my front door and climbed into the back seat of their SUV. I watched my house disappear in the rearview mirror and felt a strange certainty settle in my chest. Like a farewell I hadn't agreed to. The drive was long, quiet. Conversations whisper in the front seat, stopped when I spoke. Jokes I wasn't meant to hear ended abruptly. By the time we stopped for lunch, I was already being corrected. What to eat, how to sit, what to wear. Small humiliations disguised as care. At dinner that night, they joked about my memory lapses. Stories I knew were false. Smiles fixed in place. Concern worn like a costume. I said nothing. Silence. I'd learned, unsettled liars more than confrontation. By the 3rd day, patterns emerged. Exclusions disguised as concern. Decisions made for me. Access slowly restricted. And then one morning, I woke up alone. No car. No note that mattered. Just sandwiches in the fridge and an empty driveway. When I reached into my wallet on the beach that afternoon, my credit card was gone. So was my passport. That was the moment clarity arrived. They hadn't brought me here to reconnect. They brought me here to leave me. And while they believed confusion would save them, they forgot one thing. I built my entire life on tracking what people thought no one would notice. And this time, I was paying attention. The beach looked peaceful that afternoon, almost mocking me. The ocean rolled in steady breaths. Gulls cried overhead. Families laughed in the distance. No one noticed the old man sitting stiffly on a bench, staring at a wallet turned inside out, realizing that his life had just been rearranged without his consent. My credit card was gone. Not lost. Taken. I knew the difference. The pocket where I always kept it was too neat, too deliberately empty. I checked again anyway, then checked my jacket, my bag, my suitcase back at the cottage in my mind. It wasn't there. It hadn't fallen out. It had been removed. The passport was next. That realization came slower, heavier. I didn't even want to check, because I already knew the answer. The night before, I had placed it carefully in the inner pocket of my suitcase. That morning, when I returned to the cottage, it sat buried under folded shirts. Not where I'd left it. That wasn't carelessness. That was intention. I sat there longer than I should have, forcing myself to breathe evenly. Panic is expensive. I had spent my life teaching corporations how to spot financial manipulation, and I knew the first rule: never let emotion rush the decision. Whoever moves second wins. They wanted me confused, dependent, stranded. Fine. I stood up slowly and walked back toward the cottage, counting steps, landmarks, exits. The house was locked when I arrived. That told me everything I needed to know. They weren't coming back that day. Maybe not the next. Inside, I packed deliberately. Only essentials. Cash, clothes, documents they hadn't thought to take. They'd assumed the card was enough. Assumed I'd panic. Assumed I'd wait. They underestimated what 45 years of auditing teaches a person. I left the key on the counter. Not out of courtesy, out of calculation. If anyone asked later, I wanted no accusation of theft or trespass attached to my name. I locked the door and walked away, not looking back. The town center was 3 kilometers away. My knees protested, but pain was cheaper than helplessness. At the tourist office, a young woman with kind eyes listened patiently, while I asked about transportation options back to Montana. Flights were expensive. Too expensive. But buses existed. Long routes. Slow routes. Affordable routes. When she asked for identification, my heart dropped, then lifted. My driver's license. Old. Worn. Still valid. Still mine. That small plastic card saved me. I bought a ticket to the nearest major city. From there, I would connect again. And again, it would take days. But days were nothing compared to what staying would cost. While waiting, I sat in a cafe and replayed the last few weeks with new clarity. The condescension, the false stories, the careful framing of me as forgetful, incapable, a burden. They hadn't just abandoned me. They were building a record. By the time I boarded the bus, exhaustion had settled into my bones. The ride blurred into hours of jolting seats, gas stops, strangers coming and going. I barely slept, afraid of losing my bag, afraid of missing something else. But my mind stayed sharp, because now I had a question. What exactly did I sign 8 months ago? When I finally arrived back in Clearwater Ridge, I felt older than when I'd left, but clearer. The taxi dropped me in front of my house just after sunset. I stood there for a moment, keys in hand, overwhelmed by the relief of familiar walls. Inside, the answering machine blinked red. 17 messages. At first, Maribel sounded irritated, then confused, then concerned, then panicked. By the last message, her voice shook. "Dad, please call me. Please." I didn't. Instead, I showered, changed clothes, and drove straight to bank. Eleanor, the branch manager, looked startled when she saw me. "Mr. Hale, we've been trying to reach you. Your daughter came in yesterday. She said you lost your credit card while traveling." I met her eyes. I didn't lose it. Silence stretched between us. "She took it," I continued, "without permission, and left me stranded." Eleanor swallowed and turned to her screen. There was a cash withdrawal in Portland. $5,000. and an attempted transfer yesterday, 20,000 to an account in your daughter's name. It was blocked due to limits. I nodded once. Cold settled in my chest, but it wasn't shock. It was confirmation. Block everything. I said, new cards, new access, effective immediately. She didn't argue. From the bank, I went straight to my attorney. Martin Cole had known me for decades. He handled Alira's estate. He remembered the house paperwork. When I asked him what my legal status was regarding Maribel's home, he pulled a file without comment. Then he paused. You're not a co-borrower, he said slowly. You're a co-owner. The word landed like a weight. 1/3 ownership. Equal shares. And there's a clause. Any sale or transfer requires unanimous consent. I leaned back in my chair. They thought they were trapping me. They had handed me leverage instead. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I simply asked my next question. How fast can I initiate a sale? Martin studied me. If they resist, it goes to court. I have time, I replied. That night, I sat alone in my kitchen, staring at Alira's photograph. For the first time since her death, I felt something other than grief or guilt. I felt steady. They had mistaken silence for weakness. They were about to learn the cost of that assumption. And this was only the beginning. The night after leaving Martin's office, sleep didn't come easily. The house felt different now. Not empty, but alert, as if the walls themselves understood that something had shifted. Alira's photograph sat on the mantel where it always had, her calm eyes following me as I moved through the room. For years, grief had softened my decisions. Now clarity hardened them. Morning arrived with pale light and the ticking of the old wall clock. Coffee tasted stronger than usual. Or maybe I was. The first thing I did was change my routine. I went to the phone store and changed my number. Not forwarded, replaced. Then I created a new email address, one Maribel had never known. I updated bank records, medical offices, insurance policies. Every system that connected to my life was tightened, secured, documented. Disappearing isn't dramatic. It's administrative. By noon, I called the realtor Martin had recommended. Naomi Pierce answered on the second ring, voice brisk, professional. Naomi listened without interrupting as I explained ownership, the abandonment, the financial interference. When I finished, Naomi didn't gasp or offer sympathy. Naomi asked questions. What percentage ownership? 1/3. Any written communication from the other owners? None. Any proof of attempted financial misuse? Yes. There was a pause and, I'll pull market data this afternoon. Meet tomorrow. The house sat in a neighborhood Maribel had once called an investment. Maple-lined streets, new schools, manicured lawns. I hadn't been invited inside once since handing over the down payment. When Naomi and I stood on the sidewalk the next morning, clipboard in hand, the irony tasted bitter. Strong curb appeal. Naomi said, high demand area, families with children. This will move quickly. I nodded. Estimated value? Conservatively? 700,000. 1/3 of that number echoed in my head all the way home. That afternoon, I sent a formal notice. Certified mail. Registered delivery. Legal language stripped of emotion. Notice of intent to sell interest in jointly owned property. 30 days. No phone call. No warning. Paper speaks louder than voices ever could. That evening, I listened to the old voicemail messages one last time before disconnecting the landline. Maribel's voice had progressed from anger to panic to pleading. I erased every message. 3 days later, Naomi called again. Exterior evaluation complete. Buyer interest already present. But there's a complication. I waited. The other owners haven't responded. And someone contacted my office asking if you're cognitively impaired. There it was. The quiet campaign had begun. I expected that. I said calmly. Naomi exhaled. Then we proceed carefully. That same day, I received a letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. The language was polite, clinical, concerned. It suggested an evaluation, a temporary pause, a guardianship review in the interest of safety. They weren't just trying to stop the sale. They were trying to erase me. I forwarded the letter to Martin without comment. Martin called within the hour. They're bluffing. Poorly. What's the counter? Independent evaluation. Immediately. 3 specialists. Schedule it. The exams were thorough. Memory recall. Cognitive tests. Decision-making assessments. Financial reasoning. The neurologist smiled halfway through. Most people half your age struggle with this section. When the reports arrived, all 3 conclusions matched. Sound mind. Full capacity. No impairment. Martin submitted the findings to the court the same day. 2 weeks passed. No response from Maribel. No call. No apology. Then Naomi called again, voice sharper. Buyer ready. Cash. Wants quick close. Offer $720 if uncontested. I considered it for less than 10 seconds. Proceed. The next move belonged to the court. The hearing date arrived quietly. I didn't attend. Martin represented my interests. Naomi sat in the gallery. Maribel and Lucas were there. Martin called afterward. Judgment approved. For sale authorized. 30 days to vacate. I sat at my kitchen table, hands steady, breathing slow. The machinery had done what it was designed to do. That afternoon, I packed. Not because I had to, but because I chose to. The house held too many echoes. I found a small apartment by the river, quiet, sunlit, anonymous. I signed the lease the same day. When I moved, I left behind furniture, books, old tools. I took only essentials and Alira's photographs. The first night in the new apartment, my phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number. I let it ring. Then a text. Dad, please answer. We need to talk. I turned the phone face down and poured tea. Silence is a response. The sale finalized 2 weeks later. Funds transferred. Documents signed. Ownership dissolved. My shares settled into my account like a period at the end of a sentence. 3 days after closing, a black SUV screeched to a stop in front of the cafe where I sat reading. Maribel stepped out first. Hair undone. Face drawn. Lucas followed, jaw tight. They crossed the street fast. How could you do this? Maribel demanded, voice shaking. I closed my book. This is public property. I said calmly, lower the volume. You stole our house. I sold my share. You destroyed our lives. You tried to erase mine. People were watching now. Lucas leaned forward. You went too far. I stood. This conversation is finished. Maribel reached for my arm. I stepped back. Do not touch me again. The words carried more weight than shouting ever could. I walked away. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in years, because control had returned to where it always belonged. And there was still one thread left to cut. The weeks after the sale felt strangely quiet, like the stillness that settles after a storm finally moves out to sea. No more letters slid under my door. No unfamiliar lawyers' names appeared in my mailbox. No urgent messages blinked on my phone. Whatever strategy Maribel and Lucas had relied on was finished. Or so I thought. I was wrong. Silence, I've learned, isn't peace. Sometimes it's regrouping. I discovered that on a Tuesday morning, while sorting mail at my new apartment, among the utility bills and community notices sat a thick envelope, official-looking, stamped with a return address from a medical services group downtown. I hadn't scheduled anything. I opened it carefully. Appointment confirmation. Cognitive reassessment. Mandatory attendance. Failure to appear could be interpreted as non-cooperation. I read the letter twice, then smiled, not with humor, but recognition. They weren't done trying to control the narrative. I called Martin. They're escalating, he said after reviewing the document. But they're sloppy. This isn't court-ordered. It's intimidation. What's the best response? I asked. Attendance. Documentation. Calm. So I went. The assessment took 3 hours. Memory recall. Financial hypotheticals. Ethical scenarios. The evaluator, a sharp-eyed woman younger than my daughter, looked increasingly puzzled as the session continued. May I ask, She said finally, "Why this evaluation was requested?" I told her the truth. When I left, she shook my hand firmly. "You're one of the most coherent patients I've assessed this year." 2 days later, Martin forwarded me the report. Another clean result. Another door closed. That afternoon, Naomi called. "There's something else," she said. "A vehicle registered partially in your name. A red SUV. Lucas's. He had insisted on parking it in my garage years ago. Claimed neighborhood restrictions. Claimed convenience. I hadn't questioned it. I'd signed the paperwork without reading, like a fool. But the paperwork remembered." Naomi continued, "It's been stationary on your former property for over a year. That qualifies as abandoned property." I leaned back in my chair. "What does that mean?" "It means you can file a claim." I didn't hesitate. The process was procedural. Forms. Proof. Notices sent. 30 days. Lucas never responded. When the approval came through, I drove the SUV myself to a dealership 2 towns over. The manager inspected it, whistled softly. Low mileage. Clean history. He named a number. I accepted. The check cleared the same day. I didn't spend the money. I didn't need to. What mattered was finality. The next attempt came a week later. This time, it was Maribel's voice in my mailbox. New number, same tone, rehearsed calm. "Dad, we need to discuss some misunderstandings. Please call." I deleted it. Then came an email, sent to my old address, forwarded automatically before I shut it down completely. She wrote about family, about forgiveness, about grandchildren I hadn't seen in years. I didn't reply. The final confrontation arrived unexpectedly. I was walking home from the market when a familiar car rolled alongside me. Lucas leaned out the window. "Get in," he said. "We need to talk." "No," I replied. "This doesn't end like this." It already has. Maribel stepped out from the passenger side. Her eyes were rimmed red, her voice trembling, not with sorrow but fury. "You took everything." I met her gaze evenly. "No, I took back what was mine. You left us with nothing." "That's not true. You left yourself with consequences." Lucas laughed bitterly. "You planned this." I reacted. "To what?" Maribel snapped. "To being abandoned, to theft, to lies." People slowed to watch. Maribel lowered her voice. "You didn't have to ruin us." I leaned closer, not threatening, just firm. "You ruined yourself the moment you decided I was expendable." Lucas clenched his jaw. "You'll die alone." I nodded once. "Better alone than used." Maribel's face crumpled. For a moment, I saw the child she once was. Then it hardened again. "This isn't over." "It is," I said quietly. "For me." I walked away. That night, I disconnected the last shared account, closed the final access point, changed the locks on my digital life. Weeks passed, then months. Life simplified. Morning walks, coffee by the window, conversations with neighbors who knew nothing of my past and expected nothing from my future. One afternoon, a postcard arrived. No return address, just a coastal photograph. On the back, "Thank you for showing me the truth." Signed, H. I sat with that card for a long time. I didn't need explanations. Some lessons reached farther than intended. As the sun dipped behind the river outside my window, I felt something settle inside me. Not victory, not bitterness. Closure. And for the first time in years, the silence felt earned. Time doesn't rush after a break like that. It stretches, thins, and tests whether a decision was made out of anger or clarity. The weeks following that final street confrontation felt unreal, as if I were living in a borrowed life that hadn't yet settled into my bones. The apartment by the river became my anchor. Morning light spilled across the water in slow silver sheets, and I learned the rhythms of the place. The jogger who passed at dawn, the elderly woman who fed birds at noon, the hum of traffic that softened into background noise by evening. No one here knew my history. No one expected anything from me except courtesy. That alone felt like wealth. I stopped checking my phone obsessively. Some days, I left it in the drawer entirely. Silence, when chosen, becomes a form of control. I spent time organizing what remained of my life. Papers first, bank statements, legal documents, insurance files. Everything neat, dated, labeled. Then personal items. Elira's photographs went into new frames, fewer but carefully chosen. The ones where her smile wasn't posed. The ones where she looked at the camera, like she was about to say something important. I talked to her sometimes. Not out loud often, but in that internal way you develop after decades of partnership. I imagined what she would have said about everything that had happened. She would have been hurt, furious even, but she would have understood why I did what I did. She always understood fairness. One afternoon, Naomi called to let me know the house transfer was complete in every registry. No loose ends. No appeals filed. No motions pending. The file was officially closed. "Congratulations," Naomi said lightly. "You're finally free of it." After the call, I sat quietly for a long time. Freedom is strange when you haven't allowed yourself to feel it in years. It takes time to recognize the absence of pressure as something good rather than suspicious. I thought often about the years before everything unraveled, the small ways I had excused distance, the checks written without questions, the invitations declined without protest. I had mistaken patience for love and obligation for connection. That realization hurt more than any betrayal. I wondered where Maribel and Lucas had gone, not because I wanted to find them, but because a part of me still tried to understand how people become capable of such choices. I resisted the urge to ask around. Knowing would change nothing. Late one evening, an unfamiliar email slipped past my filters. It was brief, careful, written like a negotiation. It came from Lucas. No greeting, no apology, just words arranged to sound reasonable. He wrote about pressure, about misunderstandings, about things getting out of hand. He suggested mediation, closure, a conversation to put the past behind us. I read it twice, then I archived it. No response is still a response. The next attempt came from Maribel weeks later, a handwritten letter, forwarded through an address she shouldn't have known. The envelope shook slightly in my hands when I opened it, not from fear, but from something closer to sadness. She wrote about the grandchildren, about how confused they were, about how hard things had become since the move, about mistakes made on all sides. There was still no ownership in her words, only regret that things hadn't gone as planned. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer, not with important papers, not with trash, somewhere neutral. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires engagement. What I felt instead was distance. Spring arrived quietly. The river swelled with snowmelt, carrying debris downstream like memories shedding weight. I walked more, slowly at first, then farther. My knees complained less when I listened to them. I learned which benches caught the best afternoon sun. At the community center, a notice caught my eye. Free tax preparation assistance. Old habits die hard. I volunteered. The work was simple, familiar. People came in worried, embarrassed, grateful. Numbers still made sense when emotions didn't. Helping them felt grounding, like returning to a language I'd always spoken fluently. One afternoon, a young woman thanked me with tears in her eyes. She reminded me faintly of Maribel at that age, before ambition hardened into calculation. The comparison passed quickly, but it stayed with me. Life has a way of offering reflections when you least expect them. Months passed. Summer arrived. The postcard from H stayed tucked safely in my drawer. I never received another one. I didn't search for answers. Some things are meant to remain partial, unresolved, like sentences left intentionally unfinished. Then, one evening, a knock came at my door. I didn't expect anyone. When I opened it, a man stood there, mid-20s, nervous, hands clenched in his pockets. He looked familiar in an abstract way. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. Are you my grandfather?" The world narrowed to a single breath. We sat for hours. He didn't apologize for his parents. He didn't ask for money. He didn't demand explanations. He just wanted to understand. He had found me through old records, through a trail of documents his parents didn't know existed. He said the postcard had been his sister's idea. She hadn't been brave enough to come herself. I listened. For the first time in years, someone from that family spoke, without agenda. When he left, the apartment felt warmer, fuller, but not heavy. I realized then that justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like clarity spreading quietly, one person at a time. That night, I slept deeply. Not because wounds had vanished, but because they had finally stopped bleeding. After that visit, the days began to feel different. Not lighter exactly, but steadier, as if a long imbalance had finally corrected itself. I no longer woke with that half-second of dread that had become routine after Elira's death, the moment when the mind checks whether the pain is still there. It was still there, yes, but it had changed shape. Less sharp, less demanding. I didn't tell anyone at the community center about the visit. I didn't even tell Naomi or Martin. Some moments are not meant to be processed publicly. They are meant to be absorbed quietly, like medicine that works only if taken slowly. I returned to my routines with renewed intention. Morning walks, afternoon volunteer work, evening reading by the window as the river darkened and reflected city lights like scattered coins. I stopped watching the clock so closely. Time passed whether I measured it or not. Occasionally, thoughts of Maribel surfaced, but they no longer arrived with heat. They came like old files pulled from storage, facts without urgency. I wondered if she understood yet, not the legal outcome, but the emotional one. That control, once lost, cannot be rebranded as care. That abandonment, once chosen, cannot be erased by letters written too late. I suspected she still believed I'd acted out of spite. Let her. Truth doesn't need agreement to remain true. One afternoon, Martin called to let me know the guardianship attempt had been formally dismissed with prejudice. No further filings allowed without substantial new evidence. He said it casually, like noting the weather. I thanked him and went back to my tea. A week later, the dealership mailed confirmation that the vehicle transfer was final and irreversible. Another thread cut. Another door closed. It surprised me how little satisfaction I felt. Closure is quieter than people expect. The grandchildren, no, the young adults now, crossed my thoughts more often than I admitted. I resisted the urge to reach out. The visit had been their choice. Any next step needed to be theirs as well. I wouldn't pull them into the gravity of family conflict. They deserved a chance to define relationships without manipulation. Summer deepened. The river slowed, heavy with reflected sky. I found myself talking to neighbors more. Real conversations. Not explanations. Not defenses. Just talk. One evening, a neighbor named Arthur invited me to join a weekly chess game in the courtyard. I hadn't played in years. I lost badly the first time and laughed harder than I expected. Losing didn't feel like failure anymore. It felt like participation. At night, Elira's presence felt closer. Not as grief, but as memory warmed by acceptance. I could almost hear her voice teasing me about my stubbornness, my insistence on doing things the long way. She had loved that about me, even when it annoyed her. I wondered what she would have done differently. Then I stopped wondering. The past is not a puzzle to be solved. It's a landscape already crossed. One morning, a letter arrived with an unfamiliar return address. Inside was a simple note and signed but unmistakable in tone. It acknowledged wrongdoing. It admitted fear. It asked for nothing. I read it once and placed it beside the postcard in my drawer. No reply. Not because forgiveness was impossible, but because reconciliation requires more than recognition. It requires repair. And repair requires humility. I had not seen that yet. The months continued their steady march. Leaves changed. Air cooled. I replaced summer shirts with sweaters and found comfort in the weight of them. One afternoon, I visited Elira's resting place. I hadn't gone in over a year. The cemetery was quiet, leaves skittering along the path like shy animals. I sat on the bench beside her marker and spoke aloud for the first time in a long while. I told her I was all right. I told her I had stopped trying to save what refused to be saved. I told her I had chosen myself. Walking back to the car, I felt a calm certainty settle in my chest. Not joy, not relief, something deeper. Alignment. When winter arrived, it did so gently. Snow softened edges. Noise diminished. The city learned how to pause. During a stormy afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find a young woman from the postcard standing there. She looked older than the photograph in my memory, more resolved. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She said, "I wanted to see you before the year ended." We talked for a long time. About school. About choices. About what it means to watch adults fail and decide what not to become. She asked careful questions. I answered honestly, without bitterness. Before leaving, she hugged me, briefly, respectfully. That hug didn't heal anything, but it didn't hurt either. When the door closed behind her, I stood quietly, hands at my sides, breathing in the ordinary scent of my apartment. Tea, paper, wood polish, life. The past no longer demanded resolution. It had already given me its lesson, and I had finally learned how to listen. Winter settled in fully after that visit. The kind of winter that makes everything deliberate. Footsteps slow. Conversations shorten. Even thoughts take their time forming. I welcomed it. Cold has a way of stripping things down to what matters. The apartment felt smaller, but warmer. I rearranged furniture one evening. Not because it was necessary, but because I could. That simple freedom, moving things without needing permission or explanation, still surprised me. For years, even my silence had been negotiated. I kept volunteering at the center, though fewer people came once tax season ended. I helped with budgeting workshops instead. Young couples, retirees, single parents. Their worries were different from mine, but the numbers always told familiar stories. Fear, hope, mistakes, second chances. I never gave advice unless asked. I'd learned the cost of unsolicited guidance. Some nights, memories came uninvited. Not the explosive ones, those that burned themselves out, but the quieter scenes. Maribel as a child, asleep on the couch with a book open on her chest. Lucas the first time I shook his hand, measuring his grip, already evaluating. Elira laughing at something I couldn't hear, mouth open, eyes bright. I didn't push the memories away. I let them come and go like weather. Resistance only sharpens pain. The phone rang one evening just after dusk. An unfamiliar number. I let it ring twice before answering. It was Martin. "I wanted you to hear this from me," he said. "They've moved again. Different state. Different names on the mailbox." I understood what he was telling me without asking questions. "They won't be filing anything else," he added. "It's finished." After the call, I sat by the window watching snow fall into the river. Finished. The word landed gently, like something long overdue. I thought I would feel victorious. Instead, I felt quiet. Power taken back rarely feels dramatic. It feels like gravity returning to normal. As the year edged closer to its end, invitations arrived from neighbors. Simple things. Soup nights, card games, a New Year's potluck in the common room. I accepted some, declined others without guilt. Choice, I was learning, is a muscle that strengthens with use. On the last Sunday before the new year, I found myself sorting through old boxes, ones I had avoided since the move. Papers mostly. Receipts. Manuals. Forgotten warranties. At the bottom of one box, wrapped in tissue paper, I found Alira's handwriting. A letter. Not addressed. Not sealed. Just folded carefully. I sat down before opening it, as if my body already knew it mattered. She had written it months before her stroke. No date. No warning. Just thoughts. About aging. About fear. About how love changes shape, but doesn't disappear. One line stayed with me. If one day you have to choose between peace and belonging, choose peace. The right people will follow. I laughed softly at that. Alira always knew things before I did. That night, I slept with the letter beside my bed. The new year arrived without ceremony. No fireworks from my window, just distant sounds and soft light. I made tea, toasted quietly to the future. Didn't make resolutions. I'd already made the only one that mattered. In the weeks that followed, I noticed something unexpected. I missed not my daughter, but the idea of having a daughter. The role, the possibility. Letting go of that illusion was harder than letting go of the person she'd become. I allowed myself to grieve that, fully, without judgment. One afternoon, while shelving books, I found a small notebook Elira had kept. Recipes, lists, notes in the margins. On the back page, a phone number I didn't recognize. No name. On impulse, I called it. A woman answered, hesitant, curious. She had been Elira's friend, one I'd never met. They'd talked weekly after Maribel moved away. About loneliness, about concern, about me. She worried, the woman said gently, but she trusted you. That trust felt like a blessing handed back to me across time. I thanked the woman and hung up. That evening, I walked longer than usual. The air was cold, but my chest felt open, expansive. I realized then that the past year hadn't hardened me. It had clarified me. I knew what I would no longer tolerate. I knew what I deserved. And I knew that peace once chosen must be protected. The next letter arrived in early spring. It was brief, careful, written by someone who had learned restraint. It acknowledged harm without excuses. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It asked for boundaries. I respected that. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with the others. No response yet. Perhaps never. Some bridges are not meant to be rebuilt. Some are meant to be remembered. So we don't cross them again. As the days grew longer, I found myself planning, not out of fear, but curiosity. A short trip, a class, maybe writing down parts of the story, not to accuse, but to remember, because forgetting is easy. Understanding takes work. One morning, sitting by the window with coffee done the way Elira used to make it, almost right, never perfect, I felt something close to gratitude, not for the pain, but for the clarity that followed it. Spring arrived the way it always does when you stop waiting for it. Slowly, then all at once. One morning the river carried broken ice. The next it reflected open sky. I noticed because I had learned to notice again. When life stops demanding defense, awareness returns. I began walking farther, sometimes crossing into neighborhoods I'd never had reason to enter before. Tree-lined streets, modest homes, children riding bikes with the reckless confidence of those who have not yet learned what loss feels like. I didn't envy them. I simply observed, grateful that my memories no longer ached when I saw life continuing without me at its center. The notebook Elira left behind stayed close. I didn't read it every day. I didn't need to. Just knowing it existed was enough. Some truths don't need repetition. One afternoon, while organizing papers for a routine financial review, I realized something that surprised me. There was no unfinished business left. No unresolved accounts. No shared assets. No pending explanations. Every thread that once tethered me to fear or obligation had been cut cleanly, not violently, precisely. That realization didn't bring joy. It brought stillness. I thought about the version of myself who had once believed endurance alone could substitute for respect. Who believed time would soften selfishness? Who believed blood automatically meant loyalty? That man had lived a long time under those assumptions. I felt no shame for it, only understanding. Naivety is not stupidity. It's hope misapplied. I received one more message that spring. It came through a lawyer this time, neutral, professional. A request for acknowledgement. Not reconciliation, not money, just confirmation that no further action would be taken. I authorized Martin to respond with a single sentence. No further action is intended. That was it. After that, the attempt stopped entirely. I noticed how much mental space they had occupied once they were gone. How many thoughts had revolved around anticipation. What would come next? What accusation would appear? What defense I'd need to prepare? That vigilance faded slowly, like a muscle relaxing after years of tension. I slept better. I laughed more easily. One evening, during a community potluck, someone asked me about my family. The question was casual, unweighted. I answered honestly. I had a wife. She passed. I have people I care about. That's enough. The simplicity of that statement felt earned. As summer approached, I decided to travel. Not far, not dramatically. Just a short trip to a lakeside town, Elira, and I had once planned to visit but never did. I booked a small room, packed lightly, and left without telling anyone except the neighbor who watered my plants. The trip was quiet. Morning coffee by the water, long walks, reading without interruption. No schedule, no audience, no need to justify rest. One afternoon, while sitting on a bench overlooking the lake, I thought about legacy, not inheritance, not reputation. Legacy in the sense of what remains when control ends, what lessons echo when voices fall silent. I realized something then. My story wasn't about punishment or triumph. It was about refusal. Refusal to be diminished. Refusal to accept narratives written by others. Refusal to mistake exploitation for care. That refusal had cost me a family structure. It had given me back myself. On the last day of the trip, I wrote a letter, not to send, not to accuse, just a release. I wrote about love, about mistakes, about lines crossed and lines reclaimed. I sealed it and threw it away before leaving the room. Some words are meant only to be written. When I returned home, the apartment felt familiar in a way it hadn't before. Not temporary. Not transitional. Mine. I rearranged the bookshelves, bought a new chair for the window, planted herbs on the balcony. Small investments in a future I finally trusted. One afternoon, a familiar young man visited again, older now, steadier. He brought news, but not drama. Just facts. Graduation. A job offer. Distance from old conflicts. "I don't want to choose sides," he said quietly. "You don't have to," I replied. "You just have to choose integrity." He nodded like someone who understood more than he wanted to. Before leaving, he hesitated. "I'm glad you didn't disappear." "So am I said. After he left, I sat for a long time, thinking about how survival sometimes looks like absence until someone notices you're still standing. The seasons turned again. Another year moved forward. And I realized something that surprised me more than any betrayal ever had. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for apology. Not for explanation. Not for validation. The story had already resolved itself. Not with noise, but with balance. I had chosen peace. And peace, unlike control, does not demand witnesses. By the time the second autumn arrived, I understood something I hadn't before. Peace doesn't arrive as a single moment. It settles in layers, like dust after a long demolition. You don't notice it at first. Then one day you realize nothing hurts when you wake up. Not your body, not your thoughts, not your memories. I had stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. Stopped imagining explanations that would never be heard. Stopped bracing myself for interruptions that no longer came. My life no longer revolved around defense. I lived. Mornings began with coffee by the window, brewed slowly, deliberately, still not quite the way Alira made it, but close enough to feel respectful. I stopped correcting myself when I thought of her in the present tense. Love doesn't follow grammar rules. I volunteered less at the center and more selectively. Time, I'd learned, was the one resource I no longer gave automatically. I chose where it went. I chose who received it. That choice felt like the final inheritance Alira had left me. One afternoon, while walking along the river path, I passed a father teaching a child how to skip stones. The stones sank more often than they skipped. The child laughed anyway. I watched for a moment, then continued walking, carrying no envy, no ache, just awareness. That could have been me once, and it had been. Not everything ends in failure. Some things simply end. Late that week, a letter arrived with a familiar handwriting. Not angry, not pleading, careful. It was from Maribel. She wrote about distance, about time passing differently when control is gone, about learning that silence can be louder than arguments. She didn't ask to meet. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She wrote only to say she finally understood why I had walked away. Understanding, however late, still matters. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside Alira's letter and the postcard. That drawer had become a quiet archive, not of grievances, but of closure. I didn't respond. Not because I couldn't, but because the story between us no longer required continuation. Some acknowledgments are not invitations. Weeks later, another envelope arrived. This one thinner. Inside was a single photograph. Two young adults standing together, smiling awkwardly, holding graduation certificates. On the back, a short message. "We're okay. We hope you are too." I sat with that photograph for a long time. Then I smiled. That was enough. I realized then that legacy doesn't mean being present in someone's life forever. Sometimes it means being present long enough to teach them how to stand on their own. Winter returned, gentler this time. I didn't mind the cold. It no longer symbolized isolation. It symbolized rest. I spent evenings reading, writing small notes to myself, observations, not confessions. I wrote about mistakes I would not repeat, about boundaries I would no longer negotiate, about kindness that does not require sacrifice. I wrote about Alira, about the way she hummed while cooking, about how she always left the porch light on, even when she knew I'd be home late, about the way she believed people could change, but never at the cost of their dignity. I understood now why she had trusted me to survive what came after her. One evening, while sorting those notes, I realized I had unknowingly written something close to a will, not of possessions, but of values. It amused me. I had spent decades preparing financially for old age, yet nothing prepared me emotionally except experience. And pain, handled correctly, becomes experience. On my 79th birthday, I didn't celebrate. I observed. I made my favorite meal, took a long walk, watched the river carry winter light. No candles, no wishes. I already had what I needed. That night, I dreamed of Alira, not as she was at the end, but as she was in the middle, laughing, whole, unafraid. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. When I woke, I wasn't sad. I was grateful. Months later, while cleaning out old files, I found the original document from a house, the ones I had signed years ago without reading. I read them carefully this time. Every clause, every signature. I shook my head and smiled. Ignorance had cost me comfort. Awareness had given me freedom. I shredded the papers. Some records no longer need to exist once their lesson is learned. On a warm spring afternoon, I sat on my balcony, watching birds build nests in a nearby tree. They worked without urgency, without doubt, following instinct honed long before choice existed. It struck me how often humans confuse endurance with virtue. Endurance without respect is not strength. It is erosion. I had stopped eroding. When people at the community center asked me how I stayed so calm, I gave them a simple answer. I stopped trying to be needed. They laughed, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. Needing to be needed is how control enters quietly. One final letter arrived near the end of summer. No sender listed. Inside was a short note. "I'm learning how to live without taking. It's harder than I thought. I hope you're well." No name. I placed it in the drawer, then closed the drawer gently, as if sealing a chapter of a book that had been read all the way through. That night, I sat by the window, watching the river reflect the city lights, each one stretching and breaking across the water. Nothing stays intact when it moves. Everything changes shape. I didn't regret my choices. I didn't regret the distance. I didn't regret choosing action over explanation, boundaries over guilt, dignity over illusion. If there was one truth I carried forward, it was this: love does not require self-erasure. Family does not excuse harm. And peace is not something you are given. It is something you claim quietly and protect with your life. I finished my tea, turned off the light, and went to bed without fear of tomorrow. Because tomorrow no longer owed me anything. And I no longer owed anything to the past. If my story stayed with you, take a moment to support the channel. Follow, like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what part resonated most. Your support helps these stories reach others who may be walking a similar path.